The Feynman Imperative, Why Science Works. Written by David Christopher Lane. Narrated by Steve Toner. Chapter 1. Mysticism's Version of Intelligent Design. India, Punjab, Dera Baba Jaimal Singh, December 1981, evening, guest house. Questions and answers with Maharaj Charan Singh, spiritual leader of Radhaswami Satsang Beas. It was a serene evening, and all the foreign visitors at the Dera from various countries around the world, but particularly the United States, the United Kingdom, and Brazil, were gathered at the Dera guest house's upper meeting room to have an evening session of questions and answers with Charan Singh, the spiritual leader of Radhaswami Satsang Beas. I remember that the discussion turned to science and evolution, and at one point in the proceedings it seemed as if Charan Singh was positing a creationist position. I raised my hand and explained to my guru that I taught evolution in my Chaminade College preparatories classes, and went on to say something to the effect about whether I should be more nebulous about it given his own questioning comments on the subject. Charan laughed and then proceeded to say that science should be taught in science classes, and that in any case it was a mystery beyond our mental comprehension. I think Charan also commented that maybe the monkeys wouldn't be happy knowing about our relationship with them, reversing the usual critique of how humans don't like being related to primates. I wasn't rankled at the time by his answer, since he didn't categorically dismiss Darwin or evolution by natural selection, even if he did suggest a more mystical interpretation of how varying species came into being. However, I did become perturbed 8 years later at the Dera, where I got into a relatively heated discussion with a fellow Satsangi and author, John Davidson, when we were standing in line to do our laundry. Our conversation started off friendly enough, as he was working on a book about Christianity and was keenly interested in early Gnosticism. However, and I am not quite sure how the topic came up, we soon started talking about evolution, and I was wonderstruck by Davidson's own creationist leanings. I said something to the effect that his ideas were not evidential or scientific. I also asked him if he had ever received criticism for what he had written, and I was a bit flabbergasted by his apparent unwillingness to have his theories critiqued by others more versed in the subject. Davidson then tried to shore up his argument by saying that Charan Singh and apparently all the other masters in the Beas lineage held a view similar to his own. I then said something a bit impolite given the surroundings about how our guru really didn't know science very well and therefore shouldn't be cited as an authority on the subject. Well, our conversation went from bad to worse, and finally Davidson tapped me on the nose to silence my increasingly vocalized skepticism of his nuanced version of intelligent design. I don't think we talked much after that. Over the years, I dismissed Davidson's books on how the universe and life came into being and related subjects as mostly New Age silliness. It didn't occur to me that many of his peculiar views on creation would later be rehashed and published by the Radhaswami Beas organization. I must confess that I was a bit surprised and disheartened to see Davidson's deeply questionable perspective given the apparent imprimatur of the Science of the Soul Research Center, particularly since his views are anything but scientific. The following critique, therefore, is aimed both at Davidson and Radhaswami Beas, since both seem to hold similar views on creationism and evolution. Given that Radhaswami, under the direction of its current leader, Gurinder Singh, wants to advertise itself worldwide as a scientific enterprise, even if of the spiritual variety, it must be more open to critical views from both inside and outside of their Sangat. Science is, after all, predicated and built upon that most necessary and highly treasured feature that permeates its entire edifice, the ability to question and to doubt. The review. The first problem we confront with Radhaswami's attempt to advertise itself under the all-encompassing banner of Science of the Soul Research Center is figuring out what exactly they mean by science. In the publisher's note to John Davidson's book, it states, quote, One Being One presents a reconciliatory perspective within the current dialogue between science and religion. It is hoped that it will contribute to a better understanding of these two fields, which are often presented as contradictory." End quote. In his preface to his tome, Davidson explains that he has had a lifelong interest in nature, science, and mysticism. He mentions that a week after getting initiated by Charan Singh into the Radhaswami faith in 1967, he got his first real job at the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics at Cambridge, where he apparently assisted others in computing, which he states became my profession. Davidson is very clearly attempting to show the reader that he has a background both in science and mysticism, and because of this is well suited to guide us on the relationship between scientific and mystical traditions. As I will try to show, however, Davidson's understanding of science is fraught with difficulties. At one end, he wants to argue that Radhaswami's version of mysticism is a scientific endeavor on par with physics and chemistry, and on the other end, he wishes to severely criticize science's naturalistic methodologies. In doing this, it becomes readily apparent that Davidson's overall agenda is to have science fit in with Radhaswami's mystical worldview, and when it doesn't, he invariably finds fault with science, but he never, not once, questions Radhaswami's obvious theological purview. Thus, he is not reconciling science with mysticism, but rather championing Radhaswami's viewpoint above all else. Although he might be loath to admit such a comparison, Davidson's apologetics are not dissimilar to how certain Christian fundamentalists cherry-pick science to support their biblical worldview. Yet when the science doesn't dovetail with their belief system, as in the case of Darwinian evolution, they dismiss it and then pontificate on the superiority of what the Bible says about creation. Ironically, this is almost precisely what Davidson does throughout his book, except that he elevates mysticism and not the Bible at each and every turn. Davidson laments on page 11 of his book that, quote, "modern science suffers from the lack of an inherent spiritual perspective," end quote, and goes on to categorically allege that this absence has led science down a road of self-destruction, which have led to the rape and wreck of our planet in a previously unprecedented manner, a claim he will later contradict on page 172 when he writes, quote, "it's not science itself that is to blame for all the environmental havoc," end quote. Contrary to Davidson's lamentation, science is a process of discovery and succeeds best when it is not weighed down by metaphysical considerations. Indeed, it is precisely when science got divorced from religion that it made its greatest progress. Moreover, what Davidson takes to be spiritual is not necessarily what a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist might mean by the term. Davidson also mistakenly limits the import of what science can potentially achieve when he misleadingly claims that, quote, "science as a logically consistent description of the mechanics of the material universe rigorously excludes anything but raw empirical data and intellectual theorizing thereon," end quote. This is simply untrue. Science doesn't exclude anything a priori, and there is nothing whatsoever holding any scientist, professional or amateur, back from exploring anything that strikes his or her interests. For example, there have been pioneering studies done on consciousness at MIT, Harvard, UC San Diego, and other top-notch hard science universities. In addition, for decades, studies have been conducted at Duke and Stanford on such paranormal subjects as ESP and telepathy. More recently, meta-studies have been conducted on remote viewing and astrology. Several universities have even funded research into out-of-body and near-death experiences. Thus, Davidson's sweeping generalization overlooks what scientists are actually doing. In science, one can proffer any sort of guess one wishes about how and why a certain phenomena occurs. The key, however, is that science demands that such guesses eventually be tested to see how well they explain a given object or event. If they fail to live up to their hyped billing, then the scientists must be willing to admit to their insufficiency and try to find a better hypothesis which explains the data more accurately or more comprehensively. Interestingly, it is because science and scientists must be willing to be proven wrong, which has led to the explosion of our current knowledge about how the world works. Yet the real thorn in Davidson's side appears to be the theory of evolution by natural selection, as first developed by Charles Darwin and his later intellectual heirs such as Julian Huxley, R.A. Fisher, Theodosius Dobzhansky, Ernst Mayr, George Simpson, W.D. Hamilton, E.O. Wilson, James Watson, Francis Crick, and others. It is here that Davidson echoes his earlier books on creationism and evolution, none of which have received any serious consideration by mainstream science, and for good reason. He wants to reintroduce, even if hesitatingly, a variant version of intelligent design, but not have it hitched to the Bible. As Davidson writes, quote, "That makes no sense to me," connecting intelligent design to Genesis, but the idea of nature being permeated by an essential intelligence or consciousness that gives rise to all the natural laws and principles known and unknown does not seem like such a bad idea, end quote. The powerful thing about science is that one's personal preferences, whether one finds biblical intelligent design or mystical intelligent design persuasive, are besides the point, since what is ultimately important is whether a theory is evidential or not, and how well it can withstand critical scrutiny. In other words, what may make no sense to one person may make lots of sense to another. But in either case, such hunches mean nothing until they are tested, and that is where science comes in. Yes, we may have all sorts of hunches and predispositions about how nature should work, but as Richard Feynman, the noted physicist, reminds us, science is only concerned with discovering how nature does indeed operate, sans our own biases. And in this way we must have a never-ending ability and openness to being wrong. This is primarily why Karl Popper's notion of falsification has been so widely cited as a way of differentiating potentially viable scientific ideas from merely pseudoscientific claptrap. We must not fool ourselves, and we are the ones that can be most easily duped. Science is a form of systematic doubt, and successful experiments in science are those that can withstand doubt, as in rigorous testing, etc., from varying quarters best. Yet does Davidson, or Radhaswami Bayas for that matter, posit the same skepticism of their own mystical traditions as they do with evolution or any scientific claim that contravenes their a priori reasoning? In Davidson's book, we never see him raise even the tiniest of doubts about mysticism and its methods. Why is this so? Why be skeptical in one arena but not the other? Science cannot diminish the spiritual quest if that quest is concerned with truth and not merely dogmatic assertions taken at face value. However, spiritual paths must be open to varying interpretations and must, and this is the kicker that most paths tend to resist, be open to falsification. In other words, for any endeavor to be justifiably regarded as scientific, it must be willing to be corrected, to be changed, to be wrong. While much of spiritual literature advertises itself as scientific, we find that the very basis of almost all scientific endeavors, that of theory-making, is dismissed since it interferes with certain strongly held religious beliefs. For example, when a particular guru instructs the neophyte to go within the laboratory of one's own body to verify the factualness of their respective theology, he doesn't mention that such subjective experiences should be open to varying interpretations of what they could possibly mean, or how they may be a byproduct of the brain. This version of science is more akin to an elaborate food recipe, where the would-be chef needs to follow a set of given instructions in order to know how to make a chocolate cake or a vegetarian pizza. Applied science is successful only after certain facts are well established and known. But at this juncture, any proposed spiritual science is still in its infancy, even if some traditions would like to suggest otherwise. Such versions of science are similar to a computer program like BASIC or Unix, where if you follow just the right set of protocols, you will invariably end up with a repeatable outcome. But this leaves out the most vitally important aspect of science, something which only few meditational teachers seem to grasp, which is that science isn't a thing, but rather a process of discovery, and along that pathway there will be false starts, differences of opinion, falsifications, tentative hypotheses, and theories and even facts that are always subject to alteration or even wholesale elimination. For instance, it may be one thing for a religious tradition to say, quote, "There is no better method than that of the sound current, which is an ancient and natural science. It was designed by the Creator himself, is within every one of us, yet whole nations and entire countries of the world are ignorant of it," end quote. But it is quite another thing to then claim that such a description is part and parcel of a genuine science. Notice that the preceding quote concerning Shabbat yoga isn't alleging to be merely a scientific endeavor to be placed alongside biology or chemistry, but rather is emphatically stating, quite categorically one might add, to be more fundamental than even physics, since it was created by God himself as a path back to him. While a devotee may believe this to be the case, it is fairly obvious to an outsider that this assertion is not a scientific claim as much as a dogmatic one in the guise of scientific dressing. This is important to understand since a genuine scientific endeavor worthy of its name cannot arbitrarily pick which aspect of science they wish to utilize. In cases like this, it is as if science is employed as a form of advertising to reach interested seekers who may have been turned off by more exclusive forms of religious dogmatism. While it appeals to the rational authority of science, it does so by claiming that Shabbat yoga is the highest of all sciences, apparently forgetting in the process that any scientific endeavor worth the appellation must be open to revaluation and correction. Nowhere do we find in most meditational literature a consistent theme of falsification, where past gurus and their ideas are corrected, changed, or overthrown. What we do find, however, is a paradoxical selection of quasi-scientific language that appears to be offering a potential experimental procedure to validate inner spiritual experiences. But as we have previously noted, when closely examined, this type of rhetoric is more an instructional formula to achieve an already agreed-upon result, similar to baking a pie, and less a scientific method with all its unforeseen trajectories. Surprisingly, Shabbat yoga, or any meditational discipline that wishes to be viewed as a genuine science, would best be served if, instead of first resorting to dogmatic axioms about its ultimate truth claims, or appealing to unassailable authorities in its lineal past, it looked for ways to falsify itself. A good example of how to do this can be found in Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, where in just one sentence he explained how his whole theory of evolution by natural selection could be wrong. Wrote Darwin, quote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." End quote. Here Darwin points the pathway by which his whole theory could be turned upside down. Any spiritual endeavor desiring to be taken seriously as a science should do the same. One of the chief methodological problems with Davidson's book, as he readily admits on page 14, is that it, quote, "relies on a priori reasoning, on taking certain things for granted. I've tried to present things in a logical manner, but I do presume the existence of an all-persuasive, unseen being or intelligence," end quote. With such a metaphysical bias running throughout his book, the reader knows right from the outset that he or she is not in Kansas anymore. Regretfully, Davidson doesn't stop there but tries to equate his speculative reasoning with scientific naturalism, which grounds itself in the empirical universe around us, incorrectly suggesting that they are the same. Lest Davidson ignore the obvious, science first focuses on correlations and causations that can be verified in this world. But it doesn't claim, as he wrongly infers, that there cannot be something that transcends terra firma. Science, unlike Davidson's mysticism, doesn't have such an overarching transcendental philosophy. Here Davidson has mistaken science's practicality with an underlying metaphysic. Take, for example, the issue of whether science can indeed decide the physicality of consciousness, even despite its powerful tool of methodological naturalism. Quite simply, if consciousness is indeed beyond physics or anything within its known laws, then no matter how hard we try to ground mind to its neural structures, there will always be something missing in such reductions. And, interestingly, this gap will loom even larger because our physical science will be unable to adequately explain it. Thus, one could argue that such a physicalist approach will shine a much more illuminating light upon the problem by showing exactly where, when, and how awareness is not the result of physical properties. But if we forego this grounded scientific quest prematurely because of already accepted quadrant categorizations, the type that religions want to pose as already confirmed hierarchies, then we can and will succumb too easily and too readily and too naively to the transcendental temptation. Or, to invoke Ken Wilber's pithy parlance, you cannot make a pre-rational and trans-rational fallacy distinction, distinguishing that which is truly within the five senses from that which is not, unless you have a deep and rich and nuanced understanding of all that is indeed pre-rational. How else can one determine that which is truly trans-rational? A science of consciousness, therefore, must start with the brain. Science, in other words, can indeed point to that which is not physical because of its ultra-focused aim. Science can upend itself quite easily. The fact that it hasn't yet is why we remain so confident in its methods and its discoveries. But if in the future it comes across something that cannot be reduced to the four forces of the universe, we will be forced to reconsider. But what has happened in the past and what is still happening today is that we want to invoke transcendent explanations too quickly in order to salvage a sense of the numinous, forgetting in the process that even if all things are indeed material bits, the mystery of all this, and here comes the pun, isn't lessened by one bit. While I can appreciate that Davidson and others believe in a higher intelligence, we should not confuse our own faith with how the world works. We should also not provide false caricatures of how science is done in order to elevate our own theological biases. Davidson, in his desire to make a consciousness is all proposition, succumbs to making a number of solipsistic errors. On page 147 and 148, for instance, he argues that we cannot compare or tally our experiences of the world with others. He writes, quote, "I look at a chair, you look at a chair. What's the problem? The problem is that we have no way of comparing our two experiences to see if they tally. Perception is subjective," end quote. Well, it is certainly true that perceptions are subjective. It doesn't then follow that we cannot correlate our experiences of a chair with others. We do it all the time. That is why we don't see 2 or 3 or more people sitting in the same chair unless indulging in some sort of sophomoric prank. Moreover, neuroscience has made tremendous progress in developing ways for our subjective experiences to be understood and explained in more objective ways. Just recently, New Scientist reported that, quote, Philip Lowe of Stanford University in California is testing a portable device called the iBrain to record Stephen Hawking's brain activity and identify what they mean, end quote. I think the fundamental difficulty Davidson and perhaps others of a similar ilk have with science is that they have a mistaken understanding of the term matter and what it portends. Matter itself is not one thing, and thus it isn't surprising that there is an almost infinite spectrum of possible variations, including different perceptual modes, from a dolphin's using 3D sonar, or a bat using ultrasound, or a dog's extreme sensitivity to smells, to cite but 3 of Davidson's examples on page 148. But Davidson doesn't want to explain these variations as the result of material processes, but rather of a mind that he believes is, quote, a separate and more subtle entity than both the brain and physical reality, end quote. This unnecessary dualism, of course, is richly ironic given the title of Davidson's book, One Being One. It is here that Davidson's overall metaphysical agenda comes into full relief. He cannot imagine how matter could be responsible for consciousness and thus argues that, quote, the fundamental reality of all things is being or consciousness, not material substance, end quote. But how does Davidson know this to be ontologically true? By his a priori reasoning skills? Thankfully, issuing such grandiose statements as if by a divine fiat is not how science progresses. The very hubris he projects on science boomerangs back on Davidson when he makes such dogmatic remarks. Is it any wonder that skeptics will not find his rhetorical arguments convincing? Davidson adds more to his mystic dogmatism when he asserts, without qualification, that, quote, the one being's primary unit of creation is not made of matter. His fundamental unit is a little being, the soul, made of his own substance, in his own image, being, or consciousness." End quote. I can appreciate that such religious axioms might be expected for a catechism class for newly indoctrinated members of Radhaswami, but to pass it off in a book that pretends to be scientific is, and I will try to be polite here, a tad ridiculous. Davidson believes that it is the mind that creates the multiplicity of changing forms. He also points out that, quote, "most scientists don't like the idea of a ghost in the machine, holy or otherwise," end quote. But he then proceeds to complain that science should not always have the last word on everything. But science never does claim to have the last word on anything. That is precisely why it is progressive and why technologies change and improve over time. Science is never at a standstill and is constantly questioning and correcting itself. Can the same be said of Radhaswami? When was the last time a mystic in such a tradition contradicted a previous master or a previous doctrine in the lineage? Radhaswami and similar mystical schools are the ones attempting to have the last word, and Davidson repeatedly displays an unquestioning acceptance of Shabad Yoga mysticism over and above what science discovers. His book is not a reconciliation of science and religion. Rather, it is an unabashed apologetic to elevate a mystical worldview above all others and never deeply question his own religious tradition. Davidson argues on page 123 that the universe itself is supremely and surprisingly biofriendly. While those who are presently alive and kicking on this planet may think so, the facts tell us another story. Perhaps a laundry list of where life doesn't flourish will give us a better context in which to appreciate the not-so-bio-friendliness of the cosmos at large. There is apparently no life, as we presently recognize it, on any of the billions of stars or countless black holes or innumerable planets throughout our own Milky Way, since they are in essence uninhabitable. Where then does life bubble forth? As far as we can decipher, given our limited resources at this moment, life occurs very rarely and then usually in fairly horrific conditions where eat or be eaten rules the day and night. Most of life that issues forth does so only after massive deaths of organisms that survive only briefly, and even then under such dire circumstances that one can only wonder what anyone means by such a term as friendly. In any case, the universe is filled with an astronomical amount of unusable and unlivable territory. Statistically speaking, 99.9% or more of the cosmos is mostly not kind to life, which of course led one astute thinker to quip, quote, "If there really is a God of this universe, one thing is certain. He is very fond of lots of empty parking spaces." End quote. Clearly, we suffer from a myopic vision of how the universe operates when we only look at our own survival as indicating something about how everything is constructed. Viewed from a less anthropic purview, one can better appreciate Darwin's quote from Tennyson when he insightfully, and with an ear for a good pun, opined, quote, "Nature is red in tooth and claw." End quote. A winner of a super lottery may reflect upon how fortunate she is to win such a large prize given the circumstances, and may think that it was meant to be given that any change in her routine would have led to a different outcome, since she allowed the computer to pick her numbers at random. Indeed, she might even think of every event up to that moment being special and interrelated, since it led to such a stupendous result. However, what she doesn't think about are the millions of ticket buyers who lost and how they were not so fortunate. And how did she win? Simple answer, by chance. Understanding probability and how it applies in such circumstances gives us a much deeper insight than does our misguided belief in "it was our karma" type of thinking. The same applies, even if we are resistant to admit it, to why our planet houses life and others do not. Or, to put this in sharper relief, if creating life forms was the purpose of the universe, the designer has surely done a terrible job given the overwhelming abundance of unused space and the torturous ways that even the simplest of creatures must endure to survive for barely seconds given the abundance of eating competition. But Davidson sees none of that and instead claims on page 132, quote, that everything seems to be perfectly arranged for the existence and maintenance of life, end quote. Perfectly arranged? Apparently there must be a typo in his use of the word arranged, since a better choice would have been deranged. Yet it is in his chapter entitled A Bunch of Old Fossils, near the end of the book, where Davidson truly goes off the rails and indulges in exaggerations bordering on dishonesty. For reasons I cannot understand, to echo a similar refrain from Davidson about Christians and their take on creation, Davidson consistently misrepresents the current work being done on evolution, and in so doing sideswipes a proper understanding of the revolutionary discoveries that have been made in the past 50 years. He even goes so far as to butcher a quote without attribution in his rush to make a sweeping and inaccurate allegation that many scientists have reached the conclusion that the dynamic complexity of living organisms cannot be reconciled with underlying statistical probabilities. Of course, no names are mentioned, no references are provided, and his use of the quote, "The probability that random chance created life is roughly the same as the probability that a hurricane could blow through a junkyard and create a jumbo jet," comes from Fred Hoyle and has now become known among evolutionary theorists as Hoyle's fallacy. Ian Musgrave's widely cited book, Lies, Damned Lies, Statistics and Probability of Abiogenesis Calculations, explains it thusly. Quote, "These people, including Fred Hoyle, have committed one or more of the following errors. They calculate the probability of the formation of a modern protein, or even a complete bacterium with all modern proteins, by random events. This is not the abiogenesis theory at all. They assume that there is a fixed number of proteins, with fixed sequences for each protein that are required for life. They calculate the probability of sequential trials rather than simultaneous trials. They misunderstand what is meant by a probability calculation. They underestimate the number of functional enzymes or ribozymes present in a group of random sequences." End quote. Davidson on page 157 even cites the widely criticized canard, best epitomized in Michael Behe's book Darwin's Black Box, that, quote, "The biochemistry of even the simplest microorganism is just too incredibly complex for it to have come into being by chance." End quote. One wonders whether Davidson is even aware that this very notion of irreducible complexity has been severely criticized by molecular biologists who have gone out of their way to explain how evolution at such a level works. As the talkorigins.org points out, quote, "Michael Behe's term irreducible complexity is, to be frank, plainly silly, and here's why. Irreducible complexity is a simple concept. According to Behe, a system is irreducibly complex if its function is lost when a part is removed. Behe believes that irreducibly complex systems cannot evolve by direct gradual evolutionary mechanisms. However, standard genetic processes easily produce these structures. Nearly a century ago, these exact systems were predicted, described, and explained by the Nobel Prize-winning geneticist H.J. Muller using evolutionary theory. Thus, as explained below, so-called irreducibly complex structures are in fact evolvable and reducible. Behe gave irreducible complexity the wrong name. Behe claims that irreducibly complex systems cannot be produced directly by gradual evolution. But why not? Behe's reckoning goes like this. P1. Direct gradual evolution proceeds only by stepwise addition of parts. P2. By definition, an irreducibly complex system lacking a part is non-functional. Conclusion. Therefore, all possible direct gradual evolutionary precursors to an irreducibly complex system must be non-functional. Of course, Behe's argument is invalid since the first premise is false. Gradual evolution can do much more than just add parts. For instance, evolution can also change or remove parts. Pretty simple, eh? In contrast, Behe's irreducible complexity is restricted to only reversing the addition of parts. This is why irreducible complexity cannot tell us anything useful about how a structure did or did not evolve. With Behe's error now in hand, we immediately have the following embarrassingly facile solution to Behe's irreducible conundrum. Only two basic steps are needed to gradually evolve an irreducibly complex system from a functioning precursor. Add a part, make it necessary. It's that simple. After these two steps, removing the part will kill the function, yet the system was produced directly and gradually from a simpler functional precursor. And this is exactly what Behe alleges is impossible. As a scientific explanation, the Mullerian two-step is extremely general and powerful, since it is independent of the biological specifics of the system in question. In fact, both steps can happen simultaneously in a single event, even a single mutation. The function of the system can remain constant during the process, or it can change. The steps can be functionally beneficial, adaptive, or not, neutral. We don't even need to invoke natural selection in the process. Genetic drift or neutral evolution will do. The number of ways to add a part to a biological structure is virtually unlimited, as is the number of different ways to change a system so that a part becomes functionally essential. Plain, ordinary genetic processes can easily do both." End quote. But Davidson appears uninterested in a real dialogue with science, since it would point-by-point contravene each of his contentious and outdated pastiches. How else can he write, apparently with a clear conscience, such howlers as, quote, "There is certainly no clear evidence that life and consciousness originated from material substance," end quote. To the contrary, there is overwhelming evidence that life and consciousness are indeed the result of material processes. It is so obvious in point of fact that one winces at Davidson's arrogance when making such an all-encompassing and wrong-headed statement, particularly in light of the discovery of the structure of DNA by Watson and Crick, at Davidson's alma mater no less, at Cambridge University in 1953, and the astonishing breakthroughs in unraveling the genome of human beings and other organic creatures. And adding to his apparent ignorance of the field, Davidson goes on to univocally state on page 160 that such empirical study is, quote, "an entirely speculative theory, an unsupported extrapolation of the available data into the realm of scientific mythology," end quote. It is at this point that any reasonable reader may reflect on why Davidson is being so dishonest and disingenuous about the vast array of evidence that the varying sciences have marshaled in support of evolution by natural selection. The answer, sadly enough, is too obvious. Davidson is a religious devotee who believes, apparently absolutely and apparently quite dogmatically, in the metaphysical theology of Radhaswami Bayas, and anything which upends his cherished belief system is open game, even if it means being duplicitous in his presentations of the other side. One Being One isn't genuinely interested in a science-religion dialogue, but rather is bent on being a polemic against all that which contravenes Davidson and Radhaswami's somewhat medieval metaphysical schema. He even impugns the integrity of evolutionists, alleging that, quote, "such an interest in that which would contradict the current Darwinian paradigm is likely to be seriously bad for their career prospects," end quote. Yet Davidson doesn't seem to realize that if a scientist, following the evidence and not merely mystical dogmatism, was to discover something that upended some or all of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, he or she would be heralded as a pioneer in the field. Scientific awards, lest we forget, are given to those who discover things we don't know. The Nobel Prize in physics, chemistry, or medicine, for instance, is not given to those who merely confirm what we already know, but to those who make a singular or unique contribution. In assailing Darwinian evolution, but without mustering convincing evidence, Davidson on page 164 juxtaposes molecular biology with his own mystical theology, one where, quote, "behind all the physical processes lie the patterning processes of the formative mind, projecting subtle inner mental patterns into physical reality. This is all part of what some folk call the law of karma," end quote. Does Davidson give us even a scant of evidence for this theory? No. So how does he know that his subtle mind theory is correct, especially in contradistinction to the plethora of evidences provided by the hard sciences? The answer again is a revealing one, because his religion says so and because he believes in the veridicality of meditational experiences. Yet what is so alarming, particularly in a book that wants to be taken seriously, is that Davidson doesn't once find even the tiniest fault or crack in his own theological superstructure. In this sense, he is no different than fundamentalist Christians or Muslims who take their respective holy books as inerrant. Davidson, not the science and scientists he so mistakenly criticizes, is the one proffering a dogmatic mythology, especially when he can make such axiomatic statements as on pages 164 and 165, as, quote, "In the divine process, consciousness gives rise to matter, not the reverse. Mind and spirit give rise to bodies. That's a fundamental principle," end quote. Davidson isn't providing us with a science of the soul, but a well-worn dogma disguised in pseudoscientific language that pretends to be something that it is not. Quite frankly, One Being One is a dishonest book written not so much to bridge the gap between science and religion, but to not so subtly proselytize for Radhaswami's version of intelligent design. Even most young Earth creationists are more upfront about their agendas than Davidson is in his tome. What is it about matter that makes erstwhile monists succumb to the very dualism they wish to transcend? Davidson harps throughout his text about the one being one, but repeatedly resorts to a series of outdated models, based more on Hindu philosophy than anything offered by neuroscience, which display a dualistic chain of being more similar to Gnosticism than to absolute monism. The penultimate chapter, Present in the Presence, of Davidson's book, betrays its real thesis, and it is here that he gives up all pretense at being objective and simply tries to persuade his reader to convert to his religious way of thinking, even as he still tries to soft-pedal his spiritual counseling as some sort of universal dictum without cultural restrictions. On page 177, Davidson preaches, quote, "The divine beloved is our guide, drawing us ever one. Our effort is simply a response to his call. If we take one step towards him, he takes 100 steps towards us. And he is the one who makes us take that one step. His grace is inestimable, his love is incalculable." End quote. While such proselytizing and preaching may be appropriate for a religious catechism book, it seems entirely inappropriate and even knavish in a text that wishes to honestly present a reconciliatory perspective between science and religion. Even the imprint Science of the Soul Research Center, which is now how the Radhaswami Bayas religion wants to advertise itself in the West, seems contrived and designed to give the impression of some sort of objective science enterprise, which it clearly is not. What kind of open research is Radhaswami Bayas truly engaged in, except the reiteration of their own philosophy and the regurgitation of their own mystical practice, one which is guided by a supreme leader who the majority of followers believe to be a god in human form? There is something deeply unseemly in this approach, particularly when Radhaswami is anything but a science in the general sense of that term, and when using such an advertising ploy never engages in a critical analysis of its own belief system. Science progresses precisely because it allows for corrections and is willing to change its core ideas over time when better and more accurate theories emerge. Has Radhaswami Bayas done anything akin to this? No. Perhaps it would be better for all concerned if Gurinder Singh and Radhaswami Satsang Bayas stopped the charade of pretending to be a science and came to grips with the fact that it is a mystically oriented religion like many others around the world. Perhaps if John Davidson dropped the ruse that his book was about science and more about his own theological belief system, his readers would be better informed about his real purposes and could accept it for what it ultimately turns out to be, a fundamentalist religious tract for Radhaswami Satsang Bayas. Chapter 2, The Feynman Imperative. Don Salman wrote some very interesting notes and pointed questions on our recent review article, Mysticism's Version of Intelligent Design, on the commentary page of Brian Hines' blog, The Church for the Churchless. The following is my rejoinder. Don Salman: I'm always intrigued at how much people believe the catechism of scientists. Yes, of course, scientists like Richard Feynman no doubt believe what they say when they point out that experiments are not determined by belief. Might I point out that Feynman was a physicist who, by virtue of that statement, shows he knows little or nothing of the vast research in cognitive science, showing how profoundly ignorant we are of the extent to which our beliefs shape our conscious rational thinking. And as an interesting aside, have you noticed that the new spate of books in the field of neuroscience purporting to show us how easily our beliefs overrule our rational side almost all share a physicalist perspective? And almost to an author direct all their attention at showing how anybody with a remotely non-physicalist belief is clearly irrational? And it never seems to occur to them that it might just be remotely possible to turn their attention to their own, may I say it, beliefs, and then they might find out that this rational, belief-proof evidence they make such high and mighty and appealing noble claims about is no more impervious to bias, prejudice, and dogmatic blindness than the most intransigent medieval churchman? David Lane replies, Richard Feynman, contrary to your assumption, was not naive about the manifold ways that belief can influence the way we go about doing science, including how experiments are designed. But the key point I was making, which I should have emphasized more clearly, was that science makes progress because it follows the trail of evidence. One of the best ways of getting such evidence, of course, is by experimentation. This doesn't mean that experiments are value-free or devoid of human bias. That is why reproducibility and the ability to make unexpected predictions is one of the cornerstones in science. In other words, what a scientist wants to discover is whether a particular phenomena or observation will hold true regardless of his or her beliefs or biases. It may be one thing for a scientist to claim that he has discovered cold fusion, for instance, but the linchpin is whether others, who may not hold such a belief but who are willing to test it, can reproduce those results. If we discover that it cannot, then naturally our skepticism grows. As Feynman explained, quote, in summary, the idea is to try to give all of the information to help others to judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to judgment in one particular direction or another, end quote. Feynman was also acutely aware of how easy it was to be deceived by our own desires and beliefs and prejudices. In an illuminating commencement speech given at Caltech in 1974, later known more popularly as cargo cult science, he said, quote, the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool, end quote. Don Salman, by the way, have you actually done any research or hung out with people doing research? A few weeks of conversation with researchers would, I think, quickly reveal the extent to which bias and tightly held beliefs pervade the scientific endeavor. David Lane replies, yes, that is one of the requirements one has to do when securing a PhD and a couple of MAs. And yes, it is little wonder that biases and tightly held beliefs pervade those doing science. But again, what makes science work and progress is that it is predicated not upon what we desire or wish, but rather competing our guesses, hunches, and theories by allowing them to be tested in real-world situations and against other hypotheses and other viewpoints. In this remarkable cauldron, we uncover those ideas that survive what Karl Popper famously called falsifiability. Any ism can do the same. Science is, after all, a human enterprise and open to anyone, anytime, anywhere. But to qualify as scientific, it must do that most remarkable of things. It must be willing to be disproven, to be corrected, to admit to error. Let me illustrate this from an incident that happened to me when I bought the first Apple iPad back in 2010 and brought it to the computer technical support team at my college. I wrongly assumed that they would be mesmerized by the new gadget, and I was expecting some oohs and ahs. That is not what I got. Instead, almost from the moment they placed their hands on the touch screen and began swiping this or that app, they voiced complaints. It doesn't have flash? That sucks. No camera? No SD slots? And so on. I was taken aback and thought to myself that these techies don't appreciate a good product when it stares them in the face. But then later that night I smiled and realized that they were right to be so critical. Why? because seeing the flaws or the mistakes or the weaknesses in something and imagining better ways to do it is precisely how such tablets will be improved in the future. And so they have, as anyone with an iPad 2 or an iPad 3 will attest. Science works and advances because it is rooted in trying to spot weaknesses or flaws or insufficiencies. It is, in a way, conscious map-making, where the would-be cartographer is constantly surveying possible gaps in the best up-to-date topographies. Undoubtedly, there will be those who claim to be scientists who will try to cheat or pass off their results as scientific. But the great thing about science, and why it has had such a successful run, is that it is constantly open to correction. Nothing is sacred, not even the most cherished of ideas. No authority is beyond questioning. Einstein or Darwin or Hawking or Witten or whomever can be and has been wrong. As Feynman explains, quote, "The scientist has a lot of experience with ignorance and doubt and uncertainty, and this experience is of very great importance, I think. When a scientist doesn't know the answer to a problem, he is ignorant. When he has a hunch as to what the result is, he is uncertain. And when he is pretty darn sure of what the result is going to be, he is in some doubt. We have found it of paramount importance that in order to progress we must recognize the ignorance and leave room for doubt. Scientific knowledge is a body of statements of varying degrees of certainty, some most unsure, some nearly sure, none absolutely certain." End quote. David Lane. One doesn't have to believe in gravity, for instance, to see and acknowledge its effects. Don Salman. A complete red herring, or perhaps that's the wrong phrase. The specific phrase of yours I'm challenging as involving a belief system is the idea that science has the capacity to judge the source of consciousness, an obvious impossibility when you consider that scientists as of yet do not accept any methodology by which one could even detect the presence of consciousness. I'm including the flimsy attempts among qualitative researchers to attempt some form of introspection, which as currently practiced also does not provide any means of detecting consciousness from a scientifically acceptable perspective. As far as gravity, the only aspect of it relevant to your phrase is whether gravity is independent of consciousness. And when I say gravity, of course we realize we're not talking about anything we have direct empirical evidence of. The quantum physicist's phrase, I think it was Eddington, but I'm not sure, quote, "Something is doing something to something that we know almost nothing about," end quote. Yes, we feel something, and our instruments, which also are only known to us as forms in awareness, respond, and we hypothesize the activity of something to which we give the abstract name gravity. This has nothing to do with whether there is some force that exists entirely independent of consciousness. David Lane replies, "I find it a bit odd and perhaps a bit telling that you seem almost a priori resistant to the notion that consciousness has a physical basis. Are you sure that your own belief system isn't blinding you from at least the possibility that self-reflective awareness is grounded within a physical substratum? You, and this is not without irony, make a grandiose and absolute claim when you write that you challenge, quote, "the idea that science has the capacity to judge the source of consciousness, an obvious impossibility when you consider that scientists as of yet do not accept any methodology by which one could even detect the presence of consciousness." End quote. Impossible? I realize that you have already shown your guiding metaphysic when you cited a passage from Krishna Prem, quote, "It should be clear from introspective meditation that all forms are sustained in consciousness, and that, apart from consciousness, we know nothing and can know nothing of forms. It is, in fact, meaningless to talk of forms as existing apart from consciousness. The objects supposed by some to exist behind the forms are mere mental constructs devised for dealing with experience in practice. No one knows them, no one can ever know them. To believe in their existence is a pure act of faith." End quote. Well, I can appreciate this consciousness is all, or CIL proposition, since we are indubitably stuck to our own awareness, which invariably filters what we know about the universe at large and within. It doesn't follow that such reflective awareness cannot be the result of underlying physical properties. We should be cautious not to confuse our state of awareness with how that state came into being. V.S. Ramachandran's studies on phantom limb pain are instructive here, unless we want to fall into an infinite labyrinth of solipsism. As Rama, as he is known among his colleagues and students, wrote, quote, "With the advent of non-invasive imaging techniques such as MEG, magnetoencephalogram, and functional MRI, topographical reorganization can also be demonstrated in humans, so that it is now possible to track perceptual changes and changes in cortical topography in individual patients. We suggest, therefore, that these patients provide a valuable opportunity not only for exploring neural plasticity in the adult human brain, but also for understanding the relationship between the activity of sensory neurons and conscious experience." End quote. Now, from those suffering from phantom limb pain, and not conversant with the neural mapping which causes it, they feel as if they still have an arm or a leg, and that pain is located in one or more of their now amputated extensions. Their own conscious experience doesn't reveal that the origination of such pain is nowhere in an extended limb, but is rather part and parcel of their brain. Once this is pointed out to them, that is, once they learn to cognitively bypass their own conscious presumptions, they can be quite successful in either eliminating or greatly reducing the pain. Thus, we should be quite cautious about conflating our experiences of consciousness with how such self-awareness originates. Perhaps one of the key issues you bring to bear is when you write of the impossibility, quote, "that scientists as of yet do not accept any methodology by which one could even detect the presence of consciousness." End quote. I am not quite sure what you mean here by detection, but perhaps it is similar to Sam Harris's dilemma where he writes, quote, "The problem, however, is that no evidence for consciousness exists in the physical world. Physical events are simply mute as to whether it is like something to be what they are. The only thing in this universe that attests to the existence of consciousness is consciousness itself. The only clue to subjectivity as such is subjectivity. Absolutely nothing about a brain, when surveyed as a physical system, suggests that it is a locus of experience. Were we not already brimming with consciousness ourselves, we would find no evidence of it in the physical universe. Nor would we have any notion of the many experiential states that it gives rise to. The painfulness of pain, for instance, puts in an appearance only in consciousness. And no description of C fibers or pain-avoiding behavior will bring the subjective reality into view." End quote. I have written an extended article on Harris's conundrum, Inside Out, Sam Harris's Dilemma, and illustrated his concern by employing a Mobius strip as a fitting metaphor. In this regard, I don't think we have to disregard consciousness, Searle's first person, and only opt for a purely objective, Searle's third person, perspective. I don't see why it has to be one versus the other. And such notable scientists as Gerald Edelman, Nobel laureate and pioneering thinker in neural Darwinism, and others have long argued that both perspectives must be incorporated. But in taking this approach, I also don't see why we have to be resistant to exploring the physical basis of awareness. Indeed, I have long argued that such reductionism is altogether progressive, even if one ends up with a purely non-material explanation. In order to accomplish this aim, one doesn't have to separate the experience of awareness from its empirical mooring. I am curious as to why you are under the impression that science has to do away with consciousness in order to understand it. Science is well aware, certainly after the breakthroughs in quantum mechanics of the 1920s and the mathematical revelations of Kurt Gödel, Alonzo Church, and Alan Turing of the 1930s, that one cannot naively escape the observer component in studying nature. You write, quote, "When we hypothesize the activity of something to which we give the abstract name gravity, this has nothing to do with whether there is some force that exists entirely independent of consciousness." End quote. But therein, I think, is why we may be talking at cross purposes. Arguing that consciousness has a material basis doesn't then mean by extension that we have to make an ontological claim such as gravity or any other force is entirely independent of consciousness. That is not necessary, just as when physicists making graphene don't have to invalidate Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty when they isolate an atomic plane of graphite. Moreover, I am not arguing for a naive dualism of matter and awareness as separate entities, since I think the real blockade is mostly a linguistic confusion over the word matter as indicating something gray, flat, or one-dimensional, when in point of fact and in point of experimentation it is anything but. It was for this very reason that my wife Andrea and I presented an extended film presentation via video hookup, along with an illustrated publication, to the International Conference on Spirituality and Consciousness at the Dialbog Educational Institute in Agra, India, in 2010, explaining that religion in general, and more mystically oriented paths in particular, need to change and update their understanding of what the term matter actually means. This is why we wrote, quote, "Therefore, a very strong argument can be made that the real problem with materialism, the idea everything that arises is nothing but permutations of matter, isn't that it is the exact opposite of spirit, or that it somehow diminishes human consciousness, but rather that we do not properly appreciate what the word actually means and what it entails. To say something is just matter is akin to saying something is just light, which matter, by the way, also contains. Even when intertheoretic reductionisms hold true, there is no just about it, since the very phenomena under inspection doesn't lose its mystery by being contextually or algorithmically comprehended. If someone says that the Atlantic is merely H2O, the ocean and all its magnificence isn't lessened by such molecular equations. The trouble isn't with matter or our tendency to ground all properties to it, but rather that we are assuming that matter is one thing when it is completely the opposite of that." End quote. David Lane, "The same holds true with electromagnetism." Nathaniel Brandon provided a wonderful insight into the weaknesses of some of Ken Wilber's analogies, and I think the same applies here. Don Salman, "What was said about gravity equally applies to electromagnetism. I assume, being a physicalist, you have the assumption that electromagnetism exists independently of any kind of consciousness whatsoever. Maybe it does. Whether it does or not is not my interest here. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm only pointing out that in your comment there is a non-empirical assumption which cannot in any way, given currently acceptable scientific methodology, even be put to an experiment, much less be proven or disproven. It is utterly meaningless in the current scientific framework." David Lane replies, "Your last paragraph nicely summarizes a fundamental misinterpretation you have about my views on consciousness as being physically based. You assume that I believe that electromagnetism, quote, exists independently of any kind of consciousness whatsoever, end quote. I have never said such a thing, nor does any physicalist have to hold such a supposition, particularly in light of the statistical and probabilistic basis of fundamental physics where our experimentations, or intrusions, alter what is observed. No, my position is that consciousness is simply a different aspect of matter. Rearrange atoms in such a way and you get the elements in the periodic table, from hydrogen to iron to plutonium, etc. Rearrange those same atoms in particularly complex ways, and you get organisms with the ability for virtual simulation and self-navigation and reflection. We don't have to opt for Cartesian-style dualism or opt for silly, outdated, and inaccurate definitions of matter. One may object and say that we cannot study anything without our attendant awareness, and thus we are stuck, whether we like it or not, with all-pervading consciousness lighting up everything that we see and pontificate upon. Yes, but saying this doesn't then mean that consciousness cannot be physical. It simply means we have to reorient ourselves to a deeper understanding of the wondrous plasticity and multidimensionality of what we mean by matter in the first place. As for Sir Arthur Eddington's quote, it apparently refers not to gravity, but like you I can readily see how it could, but to his observation on Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty in 1927. Don Salman, here's something from John Searle that is relevant. Quote, "How is it that so many philosophers and cognitive scientists can say so many things that, to me at least, seem obviously false? I believe one of the unstated assumptions behind the current batch of views is that they represent the only scientifically acceptable alternatives to the anti-scientism that went with traditional dualism, the belief in the immortality of the soul, spiritualism, and so on. Acceptance of the current views is motivated not so much by an independent conviction of their truth as by a terror of what are apparently the only alternatives. That is, the choice we are tacitly presented with is between a scientific approach, as represented by one or another of the current versions of materialism, and an unscientific approach, as represented by Cartesianism or some other traditional religious conception of the mind. Sunday, July 29, 2012. End quote. David Lane replies, I have long enjoyed Searle's books and lectures, especially his acerbic style, but a closer reading of Searle reveals that he too thinks that consciousness has a material basis. He is very clear about it, especially when he writes, quote, we know consciousness happens and we know the brain does it, end quote. The question for Searle, therefore, is not if consciousness is materially produced, but how a complicated and interwoven 3 pounds of glorious meat does it. Searle isn't objecting to the physics of awareness as such, but to the proposed models and maps of how the brain produces self-reflective awareness, particularly those that have taken a purely computational approach. David Lane, there is nothing metaphysical about using anesthesia in a hospital to perform surgery on a patient, thereby rendering his waking state consciousness dormant. There is nothing metaphysical when that same patient is kept under sedation by such physical chemicals as cyclopropane. Don Salman, I'm assuming that you're taking anesthesia to be a purely non-mental or non-conscious phenomenon. Similarly, you apparently have the same assumption about cyclopropane. When the only way you or anybody could possibly know about anesthesia, do you mean the sensory phenomenon or something that is measured by certain instruments? Or any chemical or any instruments which provide information about chemicals is as a form in awareness, then your description of something as physical, along with the assumption that physical means independent of consciousness, if not metaphysical, then in more simple psychological terms is a virtually non-provable assumption. Imagine trying to prove something is consciousness independent. As soon as you think you've ascertained it, you've made it an object of consciousness. And what could the word object mean independent of subjectivity? David Lane replies, once again you mistakenly assume that I think matter and consciousness are two different properties, especially when you persist in stating, quote, the assumption that physical means independent of consciousness, end quote. Again, I have never stated such a dualism since I don't think it is at all necessary to do. Just as John Searle has pointed out that water has many aspects, including the property of wetness, it doesn't then follow that we have to ontologically separate such categories even if we may distinguish their varying emergent properties. Once again, I think the confusion is systemic and stems from the notion that we cannot get out of our own awareness to see how such a process could arise without inevitably seeing it through the lens of our own reflections on the subject. Yet that is why it is important to open up our understandings to others who may have a different view or perspective. Science focuses us not to fall prey to our own solipsism, and as such allows us to communicate our subjective offerings as open sources so that others, with similar or varying operating systems, can appraise or adjudicate them in larger arenas and larger testing. Studying consciousness scientifically doesn't necessitate eliminating the first-person narrative and only allowing a third-person description. To the contrary, both can go hand in hand. David Lane, no, I think confusing science's practical tools with metaphysics is to entirely misunderstand the very nature of how and why science progresses. Don Salman, once again, leaving aside the term metaphysical for now, we have an idealized view of science which bears little or no resemblance to the incredibly messy, emotional, prejudice-filled world of real research. I've seen scientists defend this by saying, well, yes, that's how research really works, but still we hold that before ourselves as an ideal. Yes, and if you believe the stated ideals of various professions, then there is no such thing as police corruption. All corporate CEOs are saints, and all politicians, well, we won't go there. David Lane replies, I don't think we have an idealized view of science at all. Rather, it has been pretty clear to anyone who is either engaged in science or who is familiar with books on the sociology and history of science that it is indeed a thoroughly human affair, and, as you pointed out, quite a messy one. Generally speaking, no one is claiming otherwise. Yet that, ironically, is its greatest strength, since science cannot hold out absolute truths and must by its very nature allow competing ideas and competing theories to be played out. Scientists are invariably finding faults with research design, statistical analyses, experimental protocol, and studies which make hasty inferences and conclusions. That is why science is tentative and is always looking, indeed encouraging others to test and retest observations and findings, since there can always be a missing part of the puzzle. My wife Andrea worked as a research assistant to V.S. Ramchandran, the famed neuroscientist, on visual perception at UCSD for a year or so, and she did original studies where oftentimes the results were mixed and didn't necessarily support one's own pet hypotheses or fit into the prevailing paradigm. But that is to be expected. As Richard Feynman rightly pointed out, quote, "We've learned from experience that the truth will come out. Other experimenters will repeat your experiment and find out whether you were wrong or right. Nature's phenomena will agree or they'll disagree with your theory. And although you may gain some temporary fame and excitement, you will not gain a good reputation as a scientist if you haven't tried to be very careful in this kind of work. And it's this type of integrity, this kind of care not to fool yourself, that is missing to a large extent in much of the research in cargo cult science." End quote. David Lane: "It is for that reason that I think exploring the very material basis of consciousness is the key. And why, lest we forget, we want our doctors trained in how trimethylene actually works in a real physical body and not going off ruminating about how science is merely a belief system or entirely metaphysical." Don Solman: "What do you mean by material, or a real physical body? Whatever it is, underlying it is the assumption that what is material or physical is consciousness independent." David Lane replies, "No, I don't think your logical syllogism holds. Exploring the physical basis of consciousness doesn't mean by implication that material is consciousness independent. Those who explore the very heart of quantum electrodynamics or quantum chromodynamics, and who may philosophically agree with Niels Bohr and others in their Copenhagen interpretation of subatomic physics, quote, "It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we say about nature," end quote, focuses on what they can uncover and have made tremendous progress in their pursuits. There is absolutely no reason why neuroscientists exploring the brain-consciousness connection cannot do the same. It is an unnecessary dualism that you are invoking and one that is not required to explore the neuronal basis of awareness. Don Solman: "Again, you may be right, but what materialists and physicalists usually believe is that that's just the way things are, and it has nothing to do about ruminating about belief systems or metaphysics. I'm just pointing out that there's a startling amount of ruminating, assumptions, and hidden beliefs in the use of the term material, particularly the very material basis of consciousness. Does that material basis have any association with consciousness from the beginning? Beginning also being a word fraught with difficult, unprovable assumptions. And please don't assume I'm advocating phenomenalism or skepticism. Remember, I'm not advocating any position, not non-dualism either, though that's not really a position, at least not in Nagarjuna's hands." David Lane replies, "Well, I am not altogether sure what you are driving at, since your sweeping generalizations about what materialists and physicalists usually believing that's just the way things are doesn't resonate with me, nor does it with the scientists I know. And interestingly, one of the reasons there can be progress in science is because researchers do hold certain positions and certain assumptions, but then they are required to hang those out to dry so that others may see where their particular ideas hold true and where they do not. Science only works to the degree that it can withstand an onslaught of competition, where eventually, by trial and by error, the best explanations, even if only tentatively held, hold court until another and better theory emerges. Newton's understanding of gravity was quite a breakthrough for its time, but Einstein's theory was more comprehensive and explained hitherto inexplicable problems that Newtonian physics could not, such as science and how it works over time. David Lane. Or to give another example, planes fly and have been improved over the last 100 years not because science is a metaphysical system of beliefs, but because we test and test again very physical objects in very physical arenas. Don Salman. I don't think you're actually meaning to do this, but I find in these conversations with physicalists there's often a point where they say, well, where has your metaphysics or epistemology or lucid dream experiments or whatever gotten us in 3,000 or so years? Science has given us real useful things like flying planes and bombs and eyeglasses and cars. What do you want, to give all that up? That's often the conclusion, that I'm being anti-science. David Lane replies, yes, I really do mean this. Science works because it gets tested in real-world situations. I don't know if you are anti-science, but you do seem resistant to a physical explanation of consciousness, and I think have prematurely assumed far too much about what science can and cannot accomplish by closely examining the physical parameters about how and why self-reflective awareness can arise when certain biochemical complexity is reached. Don Salman. So much has the word science become associated with the unprovable, non-empirical belief system of physicalism that to challenge it is taken to be a challenge to science itself. Rather, I'd like to think I'm defending science against dogma, carrying on in the tradition of William James, who wrote more than 100 years ago, quote, "Science taken in its essence should stand only for a method and not for any special beliefs. Yet, as habitually taken by its votaries, science has come to be identified with a certain fixed general belief, the belief that the deeper order of nature is mechanical exclusively, and that non-mechanical categories are irrational ways of conceiving and explaining even such a thing as human life." End quote. David Lane replies, this seems like a classic straw man argument, since I am not, nor are the cognitive scientists I know, defending scientism, which really isn't science at all, but rather dogmatism dressed up in cynical garb. You claim that, quote, "Science has become associated with the unprovable, non-empirical belief system of physicalism, that to challenge it is taken to be a challenge to science itself," end quote, yet you provide no specific examples with which to hang your very questionable claim. What has any of this to do with the pioneering work being done in neuroscience and its interface with consciousness? My argument is a very simple one. Let's explore the physics of awareness first and see where it leads us. If my hearing, seeing, smelling, tasting, and touching has a physical basis, for example, just think of how successful eye surgery has become in the last 2 decades, is it really that much of a stretch to think that my self-awareness is also grounded within my neural body complex? I think not, and therefore instead of getting caught in endless philosophical debates on the subject, I suggest it is wise to take a more practical approach and let scientists in different fields, from neuroscience to mathematics, be encouraged in their efforts. Consciousness studies is still in its early days, and I think we will be surprised in the decades to come to see how much progress will be made on the purely physicalist front. In conclusion, I don't think our humanity is lessened if we discover that you and I are the product of material complexity. Matter is as mystical, in the wondrous sense of that term, as anything posited in our religious scriptures. And therefore, I think our resistance to empirical explanations is based on a deep misunderstanding of what the term matter actually defines and what it signifies. Richard Feynman gave a beautiful talk in 1966 in New York City to the National Science Teachers Association that illustrated the beauty of doing science. Quote, "The world looks so different after learning science. For example, trees are made of air primarily. When they are burned, they go back to air, and in the flaming heat is released the flaming heat of the sun, which was bound in to convert the air into tree, and in the ash is the small remnant of the part which did not come from air, that came from the solid earth instead. These are beautiful things, and the content of science is wonderfully full of them. They are very inspiring, and they can be used to inspire others. Another of the qualities of science is that it teaches the value of rational thought as well as the importance of freedom of thought, the positive results that come from doubting that the lessons are all true. You must here distinguish, especially in teaching, the science from the forms or procedures that are sometimes used in developing science. It is easy to say we write, experiment, and observe and do this or that. You can copy that form exactly. But great religions are dissipated by following form without remembering the direct content of the teaching of the great leaders. In the same way, it is possible to follow form and call it science, but that is pseudoscience. In this way, we all suffer from the kind of tyranny we have today in the many institutions that have come under the influence of pseudoscientific advisors." End quote. Science isn't a thing or merely a body of facts. It is a process, a human process, no doubt, but one which works best only when we test our own pet guesses and hunches and see how well they hold up against other ideas and other hypotheses. This, in other words, is the Feynman Imperative, our willingness to be wrong. As Richard Feynman very wisely explained, quote, "I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it is much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers that might be wrong. If we will only allow that as we progress we remain unsure, we will leave opportunities for alternatives. We will not become enthusiastic for the fact, the knowledge, the absolute truth of the day, but remain always uncertain. In order to make progress, one must leave the door to the unknown ajar." End quote. Chapter 3. The Practicality of Science. I appreciate Don Salmon's openness for dialogue and for his willingness to take responsibility for any unclearness in his presentation. In light of this, I fear that I don't fully understand why Salmon would then entitle his rejoinder "The Feynman Delusion," since there is nothing in his essay that illustrates where, when, and how Richard Feynman is delusional. Indeed, I think the real delusion is in Salmon's persistence in repeating his straw man argument when he writes yet again the following, quote, "There is not a single scientific experiment that could ever be done, at least not within currently accepted bounds of scientific methodology, to determine the absolute existence of some material or physical stuff, object, thing, antimatter, or whatever you want to call it, existing absolutely independent of lived experience." End quote. Yet nowhere in my previous essay have I argued for such an agenda. Rather, I wrote this, quote, "Arguing that consciousness has a material basis doesn't then mean by extension that we have to make an ontological claim such as gravity or any other force is entirely independent of consciousness. That is not necessary, just as when physicists making graphene don't have to invalidate Heisenberg's principle of uncertainty when they isolate an atomic plane of graphite. Moreover, I am not arguing for a naive dualism of matter and awareness as separate entities, since I think the real blockade is mostly a linguistic confusion over the word matter as indicating something gray, flat, or one-dimensional, when in point of fact and in point of experimentation it is anything but." End quote. Perhaps it would be best to focus on how science actually works versus getting caught in an intractable, and I would suggest unnecessary, metaphysical debate over physicalism. Let me see if I can illustrate this better by a couple of examples. I have an old 1977 36-foot rough water boat called appropriately enough the Phantom. Invariably, something always goes wrong each summer with the boat on our trips to Catalina Island. Usually it has something to do with the generator. On one particular voyage to the backside of the island to explore surf spots, I noticed that I couldn't get the generator to turn on. This was a real bummer, since without the generator I couldn't get the onboard refrigerator to work, nor could I charge accessory items, such as our portable GPS and our iPhones and iPads. How to solve the problem? Science confronts difficulties like this all the time, and how one proceeds tells us much about how science actually works, versus our idealized and abstract notions of it. As Feynman rightly points out in his now famous lecture on how to do science, we first take a guess about what we think is happening. We can, of course, make all sorts of conjectures about why, in our case, the generator is not working. We could even, if we were so inclined, make metaphysical guesses, such as there are evil astral goblins ruining the solenoid, or that we don't have enough love and faith in the rubber belts. Eventually, however, no matter what type of guess we make, we have to conduct an experiment or test our hunches in time and space. We have to see, in other words, how well our guess will help us solve the problem. And in this sieving process of competing ideas, we discover that some hypotheses are better than others in getting the generator to work again. In my situation, it turned out that the battery that kick-started my generator was dead and had to be replaced. It was a simple, even obvious solution. All my other guesses turned out to be less than sufficient. A similar example can be drawn from oceanography, where wave prediction has been fraught with difficulties for centuries for sailors and fishermen who did not have access to more complete models of how ocean swells are generated, sometimes thousands of miles away by intense winds. In years past, fishermen would imagine all sorts of reasons why waves appeared as they did, but most of such imaginings were too bounded by superstition and folklore to be properly testable. Today, with the advent of much more sophisticated weather maps and detailed records of how hurricanes and other wind-powered storms behave, wave prediction has become both a precise science and big business for the surf industry, as witnessed by the tremendous success of Sean Collins' company Surfline, which provides predictive models around the world for professional and amateur surfer in countries from Australia to France to Fiji. Practical science isn't necessarily concerned with ultimate philosophical issues, but with getting a particular problem resolved by testing out varying and competing hypotheses. This is why Richard Feynman rightly points out that science is a process of discovery, and that the ultimate progressive tool of any scientific endeavor is to see how well it explains and predicts and resolves any particular issue, problem, or mystery. I therefore do not understand why Don Salmon continues to create a boogeyman about science when he writes, quote, "Not to say that I'm trying to prove that such independent matter or physical stuff doesn't exist. That's not my intention. Only to point out that such a belief is a non-scientific, non-empirical, unfalsifiable assumption." End quote. Science is not predicated upon an already agreed set of beliefs. If it were, we wouldn't have the progressive technologies we see today. No, it is a practical affair where results, not ideologies, hold sway. If there really were gremlins that played havoc on generators and we had ample evidence of it, then science, as a process, not as a dogma, would naturally follow up on that line of reasoning. Thus, the very reason science has tended to focus on the physical substratum of varying phenomena is because it has turned out to be a more fruitful line of inquiry. If it could be shown that King Neptune actually made waves off the coast of New Zealand, then that would be the working model of oceanographers. But that hasn't been the case, and thus Greek and Roman god conjectures haven't become the mainstay of our environmental textbooks. I find it both disingenuous and quite odd that Don Salmon can indulge in such a false and misleading caricature of how science operates, especially related to the brain and self-reflective awareness, when he writes, quote, "The physicalists have been telling us for more than a century and a half that it is a complete mystery how the stimuli from the outside world set our optical, auditory, and other nerves in motion. And then suddenly, across some kind of mysterious gap, experience takes place. But according to the Catechism of Promissory Materialism, by gum, they're going to find the answer." End quote. Huh? First, before making such sweeping generalizations, it might be wise to be laser-specific about what physicalists one is referencing, since bundling all empirical scientists in one unified camp is not only completely misleading, it is dishonest. Second, not every neuroscientist thinks it is a complete mystery about how outside stimuli engenders optical and auditory experiences. To the contrary, there have been remarkable studies on precisely these issues, and some have even led to major breakthroughs in restoring vision to erstwhile congenitally blind children. Quote, "Children who were treated with gene therapy are now able to walk and play just like any normally sighted child," said co-first author Albert M. McGuire, M.D., an associate professor of ophthalmology at Penn and a physician at Children's Hospital. "They can also carry out classroom activities without visual aids." Maguire and Bennett have been researching inherited retinal degenerations for nearly 20 years. Leber's congenital amaurosis, LCA, the target of this current study, is a group of inherited blinding diseases that damages light receptors in the retina. It usually begins stealing sight in early childhood and causes total blindness during a patient's 20s or 30s. Currently, there is no treatment for LCA. Children are able to see after a single shot of gene therapy. For children and adults in the study, functional improvements in vision followed single injections of genes that produce proteins to make light receptors work in their retinas. Walking along a dimly lit, simulated street route, the children were able to negotiate barriers they bumped into before the surgery. Another child, who since birth could only see light and shadows, stared into his father's face and said he could see the color of his eyes. Later they played soccer together." End quote. By centering on the very physical processes of seeing, the scientists found a procedure in which to improve retinal vision in both children and adults. And so have similar breakthroughs occurred in hearing and smelling. I know the latter from my own personal experience, since I lacked the ability to smell anything for nearly 4 years until I finally underwent nasal surgery. How did I get my smell back? Because physically focused doctors realized that a series of specific non-cancerous polyps had developed in my nasal passages, and their removal allowed for my sense of smell to return. To ignore the tremendous progress science has made because it focused on the physicality of vision, hearing, smelling, and touch in the past century about how incoming stimuli engenders internal experiences in the brain is to create a false impression about the current state of neuroscience and its evolution. Quite frankly, I feel our discussion is getting bogged down in metaphysical ultimacies, when the core issue should be focused on the most viable pathways for understanding the nature of awareness and why it arises in Homo sapiens the way it does. This doesn't mean that in our pursuit of third-person objective reports we have to somehow a priori exclude first-person subjective experiences. To the contrary, they both go hand in hand, as any dentist and any LASIK surgeon knows. Yet Don Salmon seems stuck to a definitional cul-de-sac that betrays what science has uncovered over the past few centuries. He writes, quote, "So when someone offers you a physicalist view, remember that he has just disappeared the entire universe, at least the universe as we know it and live it. No color, all sights have vanished, inexplicable. No sounds, nothing solid or tangible. Solid, that is, in the sense of lived experience, not the physicist's definition of solid. No smell, no taste. And since emotion as lived experience, and thoughts as lived experience, and comprehension as lived experience, well, as all cognition, affect, and volition as lived experience, is admitted, at least in dark corners of philosophically inclined academic journals, to be inexplicable, not only does the world disappear, but you disappear as well." End quote. This sweeping claim by Salmon, to put this in the politest of terms, is a classic straw man argument, since offering a physicalist view doesn't necessitate disappearing the entire universe of one's subjective experiences. Rather, by positing the physical correlations and constraints behind vision, smell, touch, and hearing, damaged senses can be repaired and new vistas reopened. I think Salmon is under the false impression that a physicalist understanding of experience somehow has to negate one's subjective experience of the same. Salmon also keeps repeating a mistaken canard when he says all of human subjective experience is inexplicable, when in point of fact and observation nothing is farther from the truth. As I have written previously, if seeing, hearing, touching, and smelling has a physical basis, which it obviously does, then is it really that much of a stretch for those interested in consciousness to focus on the physics of awareness by paying close attention to how our brains give rise to self-reflection? I think not, but Salmon is under the impression that such a quest is akin to searching for the flying spaghetti monster, and even goes so far as to write that the scientific work to ground consciousness in its material corpus is quite a strange notion. Strange? I think not, especially when we are all acutely aware of how tiny chemicals can dramatically alter our subjective experiences of the world at large. Indeed, to ignore the physics of awareness is to be blind to the very mechanisms that can both guide and disrupt our lives, from our inner ear equilibrium to nausea-inducing vertigo. Salman underlines his purview when he writes that, quote, physicalism is a faith-based, unfalsifiable, bizarre, non-empirical, dogmatic belief system which is impeding progress in virtually all areas of science, particularly neuroscience, but in evolutionary biology and physics as well, end quote. But in making this dogmatic assertion, Salman once again indulges in a straw man argument, since science is essentially a practical process, not a faith-based one. And the idea of pursuing the physics of our combinatorial awareness isn't a journey to ontologically prove that all is mere matter. No, it is much simpler than that and much more transparent. It just happens to be the case that when studying the ins and outs of our anatomy, scientists have made tremendous progress when they grounded their hypothesis in the empirical arena. If scientists made greater advances by following ghosts and goblins, then they would follow that pathway instead. But they haven't, and therein lay the key point that is lost here in our discussions. For instance, I remember 20 years ago of having a truly awful toothache. My first-person experience of pain was nearly unbearable. Naturally, I tried to figure out the source of where my experience of pain arose. I wish I could say that my Ramana Maharishi-influenced meditation sittings helped, but they did not. It was only after I went to a dentist, grounded as he was in the physicalism of pain via impacted wisdom teeth, who immediately realized that I had infected root canals and proceeded within all of but an hour to eradicate the source of my immense discomfort. I think I hugged him in the parking lot as we left, so thankful I was that he could be so masterful in alleviating me from my personal tooth torture. Now, most dentists don't spend their time in dental schools ruminating on the metaphysics of first-person awareness versus third-person objectivity, because they take on the whole a much more practical and hands-on approach. They focus in sum on the material composition of teeth and their relation to the jaw and mouth. They also, and here we are thankful to live in the 21st century and not prior ones, pay close attention to minimizing the pain associated with dental work. My argument is that science works precisely because it is practical. But that doesn't mean that in focusing on physical causes or correlations one has to somehow categorically exclude subjective experiences. Quite the opposite, since any doctor or dentist or neuroscientist worth his or her salt will be keenly interested in what one experiences under differing circumstances. Hence, the notion that scientists are out to prove the ultimate material basis of all things, particularly consciousness, misses the essential praxis of what science is about. We are all scientists to some measure. As T.H. Huxley famously essayed 150 years ago, quote, "The method of scientific investigation is nothing but the expression of the necessary mode of working of the human mind. It is simply the mode at which all phenomena are reasoned about, rendered precise and exact. There is no more difference between the mental operations of a man of science and those of an ordinary person than there is between the operations and methods of a baker or a butcher weighing out his goods in common scales and the operations of a chemist in performing a difficult and complex analysis by means of his balance and finely graduated weights. It is not that the action of the scales in the one case and the balance in the other differ in the principles of their construction or manner of working, but the beam of one is set on an infinitely finer axis than the other and of course turns by the addition of much smaller weight." End quote. And in this pursuit we are free to conjure up any hypothesis we wish about a given subject. But the linchpin in our theory-making is that we are willing to air out our own ideas and have them competitively tested to see how well they hold up under scrutiny and rigorous experimentation. Thus, pursuing the physics of awareness doesn't automatically prevent any other budding scientist from following a different line of inquiry. It just happens to be the case presently that centering on the brain has produced amazing and useful results in better understanding a large range of different mental states. This is why Huxley could argue that it is readily permissible to hypothesize that the moon is made of green cheese. The caveat, though, is that in order for such an idea to hold scientific credibility, it must be rigorously vetted amongst other competing hypotheses. And in this winnowing pathway, the most viable overlay holds sway, if even only temporarily, since science is always open to evolve and change when better ideas emerge. As Huxley wisely wrote, quote, "Do not allow yourselves to be misled by the common notion that an hypothesis is untrustworthy simply because it is an hypothesis. It is often urged in respect to some scientific conclusion that, after all, it is only an hypothesis. But what more do we have to guide us in 9/10 of the most important affairs of daily life than hypotheses, and often very ill-based ones? So that in science, where the evidence of an hypothesis is subjected to the most rigid examination, we may rightly pursue the same course. You may have hypotheses and hypotheses. A man may say, if he likes, that the moon is made of green cheese. That is an hypothesis. But another man who has devoted a great deal of time and attention to the subject, and availed himself of the most powerful telescopes in the results of the observations of others, declares that in his opinion it is probably composed of materials very similar to those of which our own earth is made up, and that is also only an hypothesis. But I need not tell you that there is an enormous difference in the value of the two hypotheses. That one which is based on sound scientific knowledge is sure to have a corresponding value, and that which is a mere hasty random guess is likely to have but little value. Every great step in our progress in discovering causes has been made in exactly the same way as that which I have detailed to you. A person observing the occurrence of certain facts and phenomena asks, naturally enough, what process, what kind of operation known to occur in nature applied to the particular case will unravel and explain the mystery. Hence you have the scientific hypothesis, and its value will be proportionate to the care and completeness with which its basis has been tested and verified. It is in these matters as in the commonest affairs of practical life. The guess of the fool will be folly, while the guess of the wise man will contain wisdom. In all cases you see that the value of the result depends on the patience and faithfulness with which the investigator applies to his hypothesis every possible kind of verification." End quote. Chapter 4. The Gravity of Science. Quote, "What is a scientist after all? It is a curious man looking through a keyhole, the keyhole of nature, trying to know what's going on." End quote. Jacques-Yves Cousteau. I enjoyed Don Salmon's recent essay and its somewhat cryptic prose. In some ways I took it to be a kind of Rorschach prompt, designed to underline Salmon's judicious citation of Wallace's quote, "The perceived exists in relationship to perceiving, and the conceived in relationship to conceiving." Of course, Salmon's essay, like his earlier piece entitled Shaving Science, is also kind of a muddle and, like certain political speeches, believes it is saying something important and profound but never quite gets around to saying it so clearly that nothing gets lost in translation. Salmon hints at this when he explains why his more recent salvo is, quote, "deliberately obscure because of the misunderstandings apparent in subsequent integral world essays commenting on the Shaving Science essay." End quote. Salmon's Delphic approach is ironic, especially if he truly wants his readers not to end up confused and misread his overall intention. I am tempted to indulge him and respond in a similarly oracular fashion, but I thought it might be more useful if I took a more practical approach. Let me start by using Frank Visser and his many contrarian Wilbur essays as my template. Salmon alleges that Visser's original way of viewing Ken Wilber is exactly the same way of viewing Visser has brought to biological evolution. And this, Salmon argues, quote, "is in its most fundamental sense anti-scientific." End quote. The first problem with Salmon's allegation is that his definition of what constitutes science may not at all be the same as what Visser, or I for that matter, mean by the term. One working definition that is often cited in various dictionaries is the systematic study of nature and its varying operations by observation and experiment. In other words, take a guess about how and why a certain phenomenon behaves in such a way, and then see how well your map holds up under differing conditions. In addition, compete your hypothesis with other transparencies and let the most evidential purview hold sway, even if only temporarily. In reading Visser closely over the years, I have observed that the more he has studied evolutionary biology, and Ken Wilber's reputed claims to represent the same, he has noticed a clear disparity between the two. Simply put, a closer reading of what Dawkins, Mayer, Gould, Simpson, Wilson, Carroll, Coyne, and others in the field actually write and believe is at odds with how Wilber portrays them. This wouldn't be so obvious at first if one were not well versed in the literature on evolution by natural selection. However, Ken Wilber's misrepresentation of biology looms larger and larger the more one studies the actual writings of those he cites. I found this to be the case, and I have written several essays illustrating Wilber's discrepancies. Visser has as well, and has dug deeper into the subject than he has in the past, and we can see the fruit of his labor. Thus, our understanding of a particular subject evolves the more we learn about it. There is nothing too surprising about this, and indeed this is how we make great progress in all fields of science, particularly in computational technologies. Within this definitional parameter, I find nothing anti-scientific about what Visser has uncovered, regardless of what personal feelings, or lack thereof, that may accompany such informational revelations. But the focus of Salmon's essay is not on Visser per se, but on me. Salmon alleges that I had a momentary lapse, from what I am not quite certain, where I, quote, with great trepidation experienced a letting go of viewing, end quote, near-death experiences. Given Salmon's abstruse wording, he admits the term he uses throughout his essay is somewhat misleading, which begs the question of why one would invoke such a term if one laments being misunderstood in previous essays. I am not altogether clear at what he is driving at, particularly when I felt no trepidation, great or small, about penning my recent views on NDEs. I have long argued for a two-pronged approach to the issue, even if my emphasis may alternate from time to time. Salmon speaks about my doubling back with almost breathtaking speed to a certain form of viewing. Again, I am sure he wants to make a point, even if his prose betrays his earnest intention. I have always felt that writing out one's thoughts is akin to map-making, just as I have long argued that much of self-reflective consciousness, Edelman's second nature, is a virtual simulator which plays out all sorts of scenarios about what may or may not happen in the future. It is also a fulcrum for ruminating about past adventures, foiled or successful. Within this context of my triune brain, or to be more mystically inclined, my varying states of awareness and cognition, I have alternating ideas at differing times about the world at large and my interaction with it. Depending on my age, the information I have accessed at that moment, and other factors, I will argue a certain train of thought. For example, is consciousness physical? While at other times, emphasizing other areas of interest and perhaps tapping into some more emotional aspects that may have been neglected, I will engage in a different line of reasoning. For example, the enchanted land. Very recently, I underlined this tripartite schema in an essay entitled Being Skeptical of Skeptics, where I employed a metaphor from Star Trek where I explained that we are combinatorial creatures, and what we find convincing and evidential at one stage in life may seem less persuasive and convincing at a later period, or vice versa. I don't think there should be anything too surprising about this, and I don't think there is anything typically unscientific about it if we realize that all our conjectures are open to scrutiny, testing, revision, and correction. We all may have our pet biases and blinders, but what makes science a progressive enterprise, and not merely a solipsistic one, is that we vent our ideas and theories and see which ones resist falsification and which ones lack sustainability. For example, I got heavily criticized 3 decades ago for my work on Eckankar, which demonstrated that its founder, the late Paul Twitchell, had plagiarized a significant portion of his book The Far Country from Julian Johnson's The Path of the Masters and With a Great Master in India. Some Eckists dismissed the findings because they believed I was a tainted source, biased in my own Indian leanings. But as I pointed out in a large number of essays, Paul Twitchell's plagiarisms can be found by almost anyone, even by devout members, regardless of how blinded I may be. The proof here is not in the messenger, I may indeed be short-sighted, but in checking the source for oneself. Then a more consensual determination of plagiarism can be made. This happened, and even Eckankar realized there were massive amounts of plagiarized material and withdrew the book from publication. My point is that in discussing issues about consciousness and the like, it may be more fruitful to spend less time on personalities and more time on the message being conveyed. Being brought up in a household of exceptionally bright legal minds, my father was an attorney, my sister is an attorney in New York City, my elder brother Joseph is clerk of the court in Los Angeles, and my late brother Michael was professor of economics and business at West Virginia University. I was taught that it was important to think through an argument from multiple viewpoints, and that it was okay to take contrarian positions, even if they contradicted what one had argued a week prior. Why? Because, if I may bastardize F. Scott Fitzgerald's famous quote about intelligence, it is important to hold contradictory ideas and still be able to function, provided one genuinely wants to understand a phenomena and not merely be an ideologue. Let me flesh this out a bit. Back in the 1990s, I was teaching a large section of fundamentalist Christian students about Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. They had a very tough time swallowing this dangerous idea because it upended a literal interpretation of Genesis and its creation account. Yet I realized in the midst of this that I should try to understand their worldview better by adopting their creationist stance. So every weekday for about 10 or so years I listened religiously, the pun is intentional, to the Bible Answer Man show, which was then on 99.5 FM on my car's radio. I rarely missed a show. I also went weekly to the Sonship Christian Bookstore in Fullerton, where I could buy any new book on creationism or intelligent design. I devoured them and got a much deeper perspective on how certain Christians viewed morphology and emergence of life on this planet. I even entertained the idea of writing a pro-creationist book just to see if I could make a more convincing argument than Michael Behe's Darwin's Black Box or Philip Johnson's Darwin on Trial. Hence, over the years, I have written lots of essays which are not of the same singular persuasion. Indeed, my 1994 text entitled Exposing Cults When the Skeptical Mind Confronts the Mystical, for Garland Publishers in New York and London for their library series on religions, is in some ways a schizophrenic work. In that book, I took many of my published articles in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and Fate magazine, and wrote critical addendums to each explaining how I had changed my mind over the succeeding years. Yes, we may write essays with a tone of certainty, but this is merely a procedure to take seriously the issue at hand. That we may be wrong in our adjudications is to be expected and even welcomed. What is more elemental, I would suggest, is focusing on the message and not getting entrapped by personal vagaries, since then we sink into the abyss of to the man and not to the idea arguments. Science works best when we use our wildest imaginations to ponder the universe at large and then put those very ruminations to the test. I see nothing anti-scientific in such an approach. I have pushed the materialist position on consciousness repeatedly in a series of essays precisely because I think the more seriously we take that proposition, the more productive findings we will uncover, even if those findings completely upturn the physicalist agenda. Or, to sound a more Cohen-like note, and to echo Solomon's cryptic invectives, those who argue a consciousness-first or all position should be on the front lines of championing a purely neuronal explanation of self-reflective awareness, since by exhausting such a possibility it will liberate, not inhibit, our understanding of ourselves. I see no problem of a meditating Buddha being a neuroscientist, just as I see no problem of one being both a fan and critic of Ken Wilber. Dodie Bellamy once wrote a long cover story in the San Diego Reader about my research on cults, and she asked, "Dave, what do you believe?" To which I answered straightforwardly, "I'm a mystical agnostic materialist. What it means is that I ultimately don't know. And in my unknowingness, I like to explore how much more I don't know." She responded, "Is this a scary position?" And I replied, "I love it. I love unknowingness." Quote, "I was born not knowing and have had only a little time to change that here and there." End quote. Richard P. Feynman. Well, I know this may not be the kind of consistency that one wants in a budding philosopher, but I feel quite comfortable getting up and meditating for 2 hours doing Shabbat yoga, reading far-out spiritual books about weird happenings in Tibet in the 1920s, and then after lunch putting on my skeptical robes and reading the likes of Michael Shermer, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Clarence Darrow, and others. Speaking metaphorically, I do think the Star Trek Enterprise works best when both Spock and Captain Kirk are allowed to play out their respective duties. Likewise, perhaps our own epistemological potencies can be best served by allowing the believer and skeptic in us to become friends and not enemies. I want to thank Donald Salmon for providing me with a new shave. It is always refreshing. Quote, "The unattainable is attained by its unattainment." End quote. Nicholas of Cusa. Chapter 5. Feynman's Flower. In my science and religion classes at California State University Long Beach and Mount San Antonio College in Walnut, I often hear complaints from some of my more devout religious students, usually Christian and usually fundamentalist, that science takes the mystery away from the universe and tends to leave only a depressing and materialist residue, where the beauty and majesty of life is reduced to a Darwinian struggle over differential reproductive successes. Well, at first glance, this may seem to be a reasonable response to the tremendous progress science has made in explaining hitherto inexplicable phenomena. The truth is the opposite of what many fear. Science, due to its progressive and corrective nature, actually expands our aesthetic horizons and thereby exponentially increases our sense of wonder and mystery about the cosmos at large. A good example of this is to juxtapose the latest findings in astronomy with the Hebrew description of creation, as espoused in the first book of the Tanakh, which was written down thousands of years ago. In Genesis chapter 1, verses 14 through 19, it states, "God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, and to separate light from darkness." Forgetting for the moment that the moon, the lesser light to govern the night, receives its light primarily from the sun, the Genesis account, though poetic and beautiful, is hampered by a limited view of the cosmos. This is not surprising, of course, given that in those days there were no telescopes and no information about how planets and stars actually formed. However, with the advent of astronomy, especially when it discarded some of its more superstitious elements, such as astrology, our understanding of the universe has undergone a radical expansion. As a quote from the movie Little Things That Jiggle put it, astronomy is Genesis rewritten and expanded nightly. We are now keenly aware that there are over 100,000 million stars in our Milky Way galaxy alone, and almost daily we learn about newly discovered distant planets, black holes, and other stellar phenomena. Astronomy's view of the universe, like the Big Bang that formed it some 13.8 billion years ago, is expanding at an unimaginable rate, and along with it so is our understanding of the vastness that surrounds us. Conversely, with the advent of high-powered microscopes, we have the ability to see hidden worlds buried deep inside living cells, providing us with intricate details about atomic worlds within. Thus, I invariably explain to my religious-minded students that science doesn't take away the mystery and the sublimity of existence, even as it tries to explain much of it, but only enlarges our parochial perspectives by its ever-increasing illuminations on what has erstwhile been kept dark and hidden. This is why Richard Feynman, the renowned physicist and Nobel Prize winner for his work on quantum electrodynamics, got a bit miffed by his artist friend who criticized him and other scientists for diminishing the beauty and charm of nature by dissecting it. As Feynman famously recounted in a filmed interview, quote, "I have a friend who's an artist, and he's sometimes taken a view which I don't agree with very well. He'll hold up a flower and say, 'Look how beautiful it is,' and I'll agree, I think. And he says, 'You see, I as an artist can see how beautiful this is, but you as a scientist, oh, take this all apart and it becomes a dull thing.' And I think he's kind of nutty. First of all, the beauty that he sees is available to other people and to me too, I believe, although I might not be quite as refined aesthetically as he is. But I can appreciate the beauty of a flower. At the same time, I see much more about the flower than he sees. I could imagine the cells in there, the complicated actions inside, which also have a beauty. I mean, it's not just beauty at this dimension of 1 centimeter. There is also a beauty at a smaller dimension, the inner structure, also the processes. The fact that the colors in the flower are evolved in order to attract insects to pollinate it is interesting. It means that insects can see the color. It adds a question. Does this aesthetic sense also exist in the lower forms that are? Why is it aesthetic? All kinds of interesting questions which a science knowledge only adds to the excitement and mystery and the awe of a flower. It only adds. I don't understand how it subtracts." End quote. Richard Feynman astutely points out that science doesn't diminish our capacity for wonder or our appreciation for beauty, but only accentuates our aesthetic sense. Those religions which believe only in sola scriptura are by their very definitions deductive systems of inquiry that continually look to reaffirm their a priori belief systems and disregard any inductive quest which could potentially upend or transform its core doctrines. This type of religion, in other words, kills the spirit of seeing knowledge by fearing the consequences of new information and thereby tragically, if unconsciously, snuffing out an appreciation for an unfolding mystery. Feynman's flower is a multi-leveled metaphor that reminds us that the wide-eyed pursuit of science can only enrich our wonder of the multiverse in which we find ourselves. As Feynman himself said best, quote, "Poets say science takes away from the beauty of the stars, mere globs of gas atoms. I too can see the stars on a desert night and feel them. But do I see less or more?" End quote. Chapter 6. Shiva Nature of Science. Quote, "Science is essentially an anarchic enterprise. Theoretical anarchism is more humanitarian and more likely to encourage progress than its law and order alternatives." End quote. Paul Feyerabend. Quote, "The scientist is not a person who gives the right answers. He's the one who asks the right questions." End quote. Claude Lévi-Strauss. Quote, "We are trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible because only in that way can we find progress." End quote. Richard P. Feynman. It is one of the curious oddities of our time that we talk so much about the scientific method as if it is one singular entity, when in point of practice it is anything but. The ultimate linchpin in science is decided not by how we go about doing it, but about how well our hunches, observations, and results tally with the universe we observe, and in turn how such intellectual lurches compare and contrast with other competing stratagems in terms of yielding more, not less, information. The very word science, derived from the Latin scire, see the Oxford English Dictionary for more on its etymology, is rather open-ended and simply means knowledge. Hence, it is along these lines that the acerbic philosopher Paul Feyerabend long argued that science isn't really a method at all in the strict sense of that term. Rather, it is a label we use to describe the testing and verifying of different ideas and maps we have about the world and allowing such templates to strenuously compete with one another. How we actually do science is invariably much sloppier than we might at first suspect, but which every scientist worth his or her salt knows too well. This is why Richard Feynman spoke so frankly when he said that the first thing we do when we try to figure out how something works in terms of physical laws is by guessing. We then check to see how well our particular guesses hold up. Given this modus operandi, we soon realize, along with T.H. Huxley, that we are all scientists at some level, whether it is trying to figure out how to bake a cherry pie for Christmas Day or fixing an old pool heater that has seen better days. Yet sometimes certain authors, in their haste to criticize some reductionistic aspects of science, resort to misleading caricatures about such an endeavor, neglecting in the process how truly accessible and messy the scientific endeavor can be. For instance, in a recent article published on Integral World, H.B. Augustine opined that, quote, "science is destructive in character because it serves to disprove and criticize," end quote, which of course is neither accurate nor insightful. Astronomy, to take just one obvious example from the sciences, isn't so about disproving anything as such, but rather about discovering vast new vistas. There is nothing destructive per se when Edwin Hubble looked through his telescope in the latter part of the 1920s and observed a red shift in the electromagnetic spectrum, whereby light from distant stellar objects appeared to be moving away from his point of inquiry. Hubble's record only served to confirm what the Belgian priest and physicist Georges Lemaitre had deduced 2 years prior from Einstein's general theory of relativity, that is, that the universe must be expanding. Yes, it is certainly the case that reductionism is part of science, but so is almost any human endeavor, including the very use of symbols, from Mandarin Chinese to Sanskrit, and vocal sound waves to communicate and explain complex features found in nature. But to suggest, as Augustine naively does, that the scientific method is all about divide and conquer is to overlook the fantastic panorama of how we go about gathering knowledge. Contrary to popular misconceptions, there is nothing holding any would-be scientist back from taking a holistic or integral approach to his subject. Indeed, many great theorists have already done exactly that, ranging from such Nobel laureates as Ilya Prigozhin, who focused on complexity and dissipative structures, to Gerald Edelman, whose pioneering work on the brain and consciousness is underlined with a deep appreciation for the emergent properties of qualia and self-reflective consciousness, which he refers to as second nature. The noted physicist Steven Weinberg points out that a distinction should be made between grand reductionism and petty reductionism, since the latter, he argues, is, quote, "not worth a fierce defense. Sometimes things can be explained by studying their constituents, sometimes not. When Einstein explained Newton's theories of motion and gravitation, he was not committing petty reductionism. His explanation was not based on some theory about the constituents of anything, but rather on a new physical principle, the general principle of relativity, which is embodied in his theory of curved space-time. In fact, petty reductionism in physics has probably run its course. Just as it doesn't make sense to talk about the hardness or temperature or intelligence of individual elementary particles, it is also not possible to give a precise meaning to statements about particles being composed of other particles. We do speak loosely of a proton as being composed of 3 quarks, but if you look very closely at a quark, you will find it surrounded with a cloud of quarks and antiquarks and other particles, occasionally bound into protons. So at least for a brief moment we could say that the quark is made of protons." End quote. Indeed, the renowned Santa Fe Institute, founded by such luminaries as Murray Gell-Mann, Nobel Prize winner for his theoretical work on elementary particles and more popularly known for his naming of quarks, supports a whole host of non-reductionist scientific studies. Thus, it is ironic that in prematurely trying to criticize a particular aspect of science, among a host of varying other aspects, one would resort to reducing all of science into a cheap and wholly misleading soundbite in order to champion its purported alternative. No, the truth is that the human drive to gather knowledge and then openly compare and contrast such theoretic and observational templates is an expansive field and one that allows for all sorts of imaginative pathways. In other words, science is a quest with many methods and not just one. Analogously, science is like the Hindu god Shiva, who is often depicted with multiple arms, signifying his illustrious powers to take on different forms and act in manifold ways. While it is certainly true that one aspect of his nature is destructive, it is also true that Shiva is depicted as a transformer. Accordingly, Shiva has numerous aspects ranging from beneficent to frightening. But one of his more popular aspects is as a universal dancer, perhaps best illustrated artistically in bronze casts as Nataraja. Science, like Shiva, cannot be confined to only one aspect. To focus on only one feature of science to the exclusion of others in order to misleadingly characterize its multiform nature, so as to elevate another method to a higher ranking, is to perpetuate a falsehood. Ironically, even though we value science for many of the predictions and technological inventions it makes from time to time, we imprison its potential value when we try to limit its Shiva-like nature. As Lewis Thomas insightfully pointed out in his 1980 tome, Late Night Thoughts on Listening to Mahler's Ninth Symphony, quote, "Science is useful, indispensable sometimes, but whenever it moves forward, it does so by producing a surprise. You cannot specify the surprise you'd like." End quote. There are, in sum, innumerable ways to gather knowledge about the cosmos we inhabit. What makes science so powerful is that it allows for such findings to be publicly aired and scrutinized and tested, not only with the world it is trying to understand, but with other vying alternative models which differ from each other. Perhaps science's greatest contribution is that at its best it is open to refutation and is thereby open to change. Carl Sagan summarized it thusly, quote, "In science it often happens that scientists say, 'You know, that's a really good argument. My position is mistaken.' And then they would actually change their minds and you never hear that old view from them again. They really do it. It doesn't happen as often as it should because scientists are human and change is sometimes painful, but it happens every day." End quote. An often told and questionably attributed joke concerning Albert Einstein perhaps reveals best the tentative nature of science and its findings. Student: "Dr. Einstein, aren't these the same questions as last year's physics final exam?" Dr. Einstein: "Yes, but this year the answers are different."